What is the most misunderstood or misinterpreted part of the Bible? What is the most mispreached by preachers portion of the Bible? I'll put it in this way for you. What is the largest genre of the Bible then? A genre is a type of writing or literature in the Bible. And what is the largest genre of the Bible? It is historical narrative. 60% of our Bible is in the genre of historical narrative. And that is the most misinterpreted and the most mispreached by preachers portion of the Bible. That is it. So what is historical narrative? As the name implies, historical narrative, that's a history being narrated. To narrate is to tell, to explain, to describe. So historical narrative, it is the describing of the story of God as it unfolded in history, in cultures, in ancient history. So 60% of our Bible is in the genre of historical narrative. And unfortunately, that largest part of the Bible in terms of genre is also the most misinterpreted and the most mispreached part of our Bible. And I'm going to tell you why. So, historical narrative is the largest genre in the Bible. The other genres are, poetry and wisdom, where we find books like Psalms, Proverbs, okay? We also have the genre of prophets, okay? Isaiah, Jeremiah, all the way to Zechariah, Malachi, okay? Whether they are major or minor prophets, that is a genre of prophets. The other genre that we see in the Bible, especially when we cross over to the New Testament, we find the Gospels, and we also find the epistles, the letters, and then lastly, we find what we call apocalyptic literature, which is a prophecy of the last days, particularly the book of Revelation, okay? But the largest genre in the Bible is historical narrative. And look where it starts and up to where it runs. Historical narrative spans from the book of Genesis all the way to the book of Esther. So there are lots of books in between here. There may be some portions of the law and a little bit of like prophetic utterances, but the majority of that distance from Genesis, Exodus, okay, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, okay, Judges, okay, you go all the way Ruth, you talk about Samuel, you talk about Kings, you talk about Chronicles, okay, that is all about historical narrative. Somebody is narrating what happened, is describing whatever happened in ancient history in relation to the story of God, which is the story of redemption, okay, which led to Jesus Christ the Savior, okay. Now, historical narrative does not end in the Old Testament. It is also there in the New Testament. All those four Gospels, apart from being the Gospels, those four Gospels, they are in the form of historical narrative. Because somebody is narrating what happened in history in terms of how Jesus came into this world, how he grew up, what he did, and what he taught, and how he closed his work in this earth, and how he ascended to heaven. Right? So even the Gospels, although they are the Gospels, they are also in the form of narration. Somebody is narrating things as they unfolded amongst the people in history, in those cultures and political scenarios or circumstances. And historical narrative doesn't end with the Gospels. It ends with the book of Acts. The book of Acts is all historical narrative. All right? And after that, we start the epistles now. That's another genre, okay? The genre of epistles, okay? So, the most misunderstood or misinterpreted and mispreached by preachers, many pastors, prophets, or whatsoever, it is historical narrative. It is the largest genre of the Bible, the largest portion of the Bible, yet it is also the most misunderstood, misinterpreted, and also mispreached. So, it's very concerning because we are missing a lot of what God wanted to communicate to us by misinterpreting and mispreaching historical narrative, which is the largest portion or the largest genre of the Bible. So, how should we approach the genre of historical narrative in the Bible so that we understand what God is communicating to us and we interpret correctly and we preach it correctly? So I'm going to show you several mistakes, okay, that people make. And I'm also going to give you several tips that will open your eyes on how you can correctly handle and interpret the genre of historical narrative. By the way, I forgot to tell you that the genre of historical narrative, and here is the reason why it is mostly misunderstood or misinterpreted and mispreached. Why? because it is also the most cinematic, it is also the most entertaining genre of the Bible. Because in historical narrative, we hear about the victories of Israel. We hear about the likes of David versus Goliath. We hear about the likes of Gideon. We hear about the likes of Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal. So when we hear these stories, we get excited and we get carried away and end up misinterpreting these things. So here are the tips that will help us all to correctly interpret, okay, the genre of historical narrative. Number one, okay, you must always know and remember that the Bible is not our book. It is God's book. And being God's book, the Bible is the story of God, not our story. Okay? We are featured in that story. Okay? We are the beneficiary of the Bible, of the story of God. But that story is not ours. In other words, everything that's written in the Bible, including that which is written in historical narrative, the stories of David versus Goliath, the stories of Elijah versus the prophets of Baal, the stories of Moses or the Exodus and all that, those stories are written in the Bible not to show us, to showcase we the people. No. Every passage in the Bible, because the Bible is God's book and God's story, everything in the Bible is written to reveal God himself. The hero of the Bible is God, not any other person. Okay? God is the hero of every story and passage and verse in the Bible, particularly in historical narrative. So if you are reading the story of Elijah versus the prophets of Baal, the hero is not Elijah. You are mistaken. You have missed the correct interpretation. When you read the story of David versus Goliath, David is not the hero of that story. Every story in the Bible, put it in your mind. And this must guide your interpretation of historical narrative. Every story, every passage in the Bible that is in the genre of historical narrative, you must be guided by the understanding that the real hero of every biblical story or passage is not Moses, is not David, is not Elijah, is not Gideon, is not Jephthah, is not Jabez, is not any other human being, no matter how anointed they were. There is no human hero in the Bible, because the Bible is not a person's book. Neither was it written to showcase the heroism of any human being. This is where we misinterpret historical narrative. Because it's like we are watching a movie of David versus Goliath or Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. And we say, okay, who is the hero here? Who is the winner and who is the loser? David in that story is not the hero or the winner. If you have spiritual eyes and you have interpreted the historical narrative correctly, you will always come to the conclusion that the real hero wasn't David. That story of David versus Goliath was written for the ultimate purpose of showcasing who God is, how faithful he is, and how his program of redeeming mankind unfolded in history towards the incarnation of Christ. So tip number one is that every story in the Bible, the entire Bible, God is the hero. God is the hero of every Bible story. The purpose of every story in that Bible, which unfolded in history and it was narrated in historical narrative, the purpose, the reason why it's written in the Bible, it is to show how God revealed himself and moved in history. That's the ultimate purpose. So if you're interpreting historical narrative correctly, you'll be guided by that principle. It was God who set him up there. So that story, the real hero is God, not David. Number two, historical narrative is descriptive and not prescriptive. Historical narrative is not teaching you directly. It doesn't give instructions. It only describes what happens in history. So you need to be very careful because it's not prescriptive. It's not prescribing. The lesson is always hidden. And the lesson is always God's story. Finally, not every victory in the historical narrative belongs to us today or applies to us today. Because the circumstances may be different. Stay blessed.